Is the idea of two-tier policing any more than a mad conspiracy theory? Now, the family of Chris Cabba claimed the acquittal of an armed police officer who'd been accused of murdering the unarmed man in 2022. I don't know why we keep describing him as an unarmed man. Yes, he may not have had a gun, but he did try and ram a police roadblock, is a sign that the justice system does not treat black people fairly. Richard Tice, you've been talking about this today, I gather.
I have, in a different context. I asked about two-tier policing, two-tier justice. Look, I think on this particular case, frankly, I don't think it should have gone to trial in the first place, but it's gone to trial, the jury's reached a verdict, and our armed forces have to make split-second judgments, and as you just touched on in this situation, here was a man who was trying to evade arrest over some period of time in a car that had been involved in an armed incident the night before. So I'm surprised it went to trial, but I am genuinely worried about two-tier justice. We've got a situation where, if you say and write something daft and inappropriate and wrong on social media and delete it a couple of hours later, you can go to jail for 2 years in this country. But actually, if you assault a police officer in an airport, brutally, violently, break their noses, 4 months later, you still haven't been charged. And I think that is two-tier policing and two-tier justice. And I think that's really upsetting people.
If there was some sort of conspiracy about that, it would
I don't think it's conspiracy.
Some police forces do things one way, some police forces do things another. That doesn't really meet the definition of two-tier, does it? It just means that one's more competent than the other.
Well, but it's the CPS who makes the decision whether or not to prosecute. And if you've got video evidence of someone standing and shouting at a police officer, and you say, well, that's the video evidence, arrest, charge, convict and sentence, that can happen in a matter of 2 weeks. Why can't it happen in this other instance where someone literally floors an officer, brutally assaults them, you've got the video evidence, no one's explained to me.
So what's behind it?
I don't know. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, I'm just saying what is going on? That must be two-tier justice under the CPS. They need to explain themselves, frankly, because trust in policing and our justice system is really important, and I fear that it's ebbing away.
Emily Thornberry, in a former life you were a barrister. Your husband's a judge. What do you make of this?
Yeah, keep my husband out of this. It's not his fault.
Sorry, as soon as I said it, I thought that was unfair.
I think there's a lot going on here. So I think the first thing is that in relation to Chris Cabba, it was a really difficult decision to make. You hardly ever get police officers charged with manslaughter or murder where someone has died having been in contact, to use as neutral a phrase as possible, with the police. It happens very rarely indeed, and it's a very difficult decision to make. And quite clearly there was what's called prima facie evidence. There was evidence that looked like on the balance of probabilities there was a chance that there would be a conviction, and that's why the Crown Prosecution Service made that decision. And then it's checked. There are checks and balances. It's checked when it goes to trial, because at the end of the prosecution case, it's up to the defence, but the defence can ask the judge to chuck it out if there isn't enough evidence to go all the way. So this was a case, it looks like, where there was sufficient evidence to convict, and it was a matter for a jury. And then thank goodness for the common sense of juries who come in, and they are our experts in common sense. They have much more expert than common sense than any of us, and certainly more than most lawyers. And we bring them in because of their experience of life, and they're the ones who make the decision. And sometimes they convict and sometimes they acquit. And it's very, very hard for a family who have lost someone in the circumstances in which Chris Cabba's family have lost, Chris. But it is one, and tonight we're in circumstances where we've had armed police officers, threatening to essentially go on strike because the defendant was charged, and on the other hand, we have a community grieving and saying it's not fair that he wasn't convicted. These are very difficult circumstances, and personally, I think that it is incumbent on politicians to try and hold communities together and not use rhetoric and to try to divide us further.
Justine.
And that's why the rule of law and people being equal under the rule of law matters so much, and that due process, because there is only one way in the end you can prove to people that everybody has had a same fair shot in the justice system, and that is trial by jury and a clear process that everyone goes through irrespective of who they are.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is sometimes now is that there are some cases that are extremely high profile, and I think when that happens, the police take extra care. And I guess one of the challenges that then happens is possibly it feels like there's feet dragging and it's taking longer than it needs to, when in fact actually what's happening is people are just trying to absolutely make sure that if a case gets brought to court, it doesn't fail because, if you like, the previous process to build the case has not been done effectively. But I don't think there is two-tier policing. But I do think there are some areas where sentencing feels like it's out of kilter depending on what the crime is. And I think that's an issue for Parliament, isn't it, in many respects, to periodically review the balances between different crimes in a different age and see whether that balance stays in the right place.
The sentences that were meted out to people involved in the riots, for example, they do look punitive in comparison to other cases that have happened of a similar nature. But they
weren't of a similar nature. That's the whole point. They weren't of a similar nature in the context of riots that were happening where, it was a threat to the stability of the nation. This wasn't just like, Saturday night and a few people getting drunk and smashing some windows. This was, This was an uprising that was happening around the country with different communities.
Yeah, and the sentences meant that they didn't do it again.
Bluntly, it was political sentencing. And, what is worse? Is it worse standing outside somewhere with...
What do you mean political sentencing?
This was sentencing with a political purpose done very, very rapidly.
Well, the purpose was to stop the riots.
Well, and so exactly.
And provide a deterrent.
So you've just agreed with me that it's political sentencing.
Well, it was a
political judgment. It was a political judgment to stop the riots.
Involved in it.
It was up to our Prime Minister stood up at a press conference and said people will be dealt with very harshly. And gave
that's what I expected.
I'm not agreeing with that, but it was political sentencing, and that sentencing was harsher than, for example, sex offenders. So, that comes back to confidence in the system, confidence in sentencing, confidence in the justice system.
But, Emily, sorry, Jonathan, I'm bringing you in a second. Emily, what do you make about Richard's theory here, that there is a sort of wider two-tier policing or wider two-tier justice system?
I think it's just nonsense.
I think what I would like to understand, Richard, is, are you saying that if someone has a political motivation for rioting, then they should get a lesser sentence?
I'm not saying that at all. No, absolutely not. No, don't misunderstand me. Emily's right. You've got to stop the rioting. And so there was a very clear mandate: get them arrested, get them charged, get them sentenced. But what we're left with is a degree of sentencing where you say, how's that comparable? Because you've done and said something ridiculous and daft and bad on social media that you've apologised for and taken down 2 hours later, as opposed to literally sex offenders not being sent to jail, not being dealt with appropriately. That's where people have a loss of confidence.
Except this was a highly volatile situation. It wasn't political or punitive. It was preventative, wasn't it? What were the alternatives? Calling out the army, the militia. And I think actually it had widespread support. By the way, going back to the original question,
bringing back hanging would have widespread support. That's not an argument.
No, but it was a fact. Okay, well, it worked. Let's put it that way. It was a very stark warning to everybody else who might have done copycat. And that's a great deal danger with these sort of things. The copycat effect. It was stopped right in the track, very effectively.
So you've all actually agreed with me that this was political sentencing with an objective.
It was about combating a broader sense of disorder and threat to public person and property.
Which is a political judgment. My complaint is...
that's not a political judgment. That's just about having law and order in the country. That's not politics. That's law and order. And I think no political party would take a different perspective on this.
Is your complaint, Richard, that when you talk about people putting things on social media that are stupid and they apologise for and they take it down a few hours later, are you talking about incitement? Are you talking about incitement to violence? Are you talking about putting up stuff that's that's encouraging people to go out and riot?
I'm talking about
undermine the stability of our country. Because if that's what you just think is just stupid and they shouldn't have been punished, then I think you're on another planet, mate.
Well, I'm not on another planet. I'm on this planet. And let's be clear: is that appropriate to send someone to jail for 2 or 3 years?
Incitement?
For 2 or 3 years. And if the judgment is yes, well, that's the country we now live. That's a very serious political judgment.
I thought you believed in harsh sentences and deterrence, but apparently not on this issue.
No, I do believe in harsh sentences and deterrence, but it's about consistency. And what we're clearly seeing is there isn't consistency.
But hang on.
If you're doing that, are you going to send a proper deterrent to people who are sex offenders?
But I
are you
think
going to send a proper deterrent to people
I
who
think
are...
those sentences which were comparable with the 2011 riots that we had in London, which really threatened to get out of control and spread to other cities.
Look, my point is, why have people not been even charged for smashing up and beating up and flooring and breaking the bones of police officers?
That's a separate
No,
case.
it's not a separate issue.
It is in the sense that it's a separate
about
case. I think if
consistency
people
and
have
trust in the system.
different sentences for rioting, that would be two-tier. But what we're talking about is a separate case entirely that's been investigated by the police that hasn't even been brought to court yet.
And look, I'm sympathetic to your argument on that, but I've learned through bitter experience when you see these videos and they look as if it's a cast iron case that, well, these people should be arrested, charged and banged up. There's often something that you haven't seen in the video that the police still have to take into account. So, as I say,
4 months, 5 months, really?
My heart is with you, but then my head says, well, you never know. But
if you accept that, you frankly accept the state this country is in. The place is, so much doesn't work because there's a lack of common sense in parts of the public sector at getting stuff done. And whether it's the NHS, whether it's the justice system, there's just too much where it's acceptable to take way too long.